Good morning, everyone. I feel like I'm blinded by the lights. I can't see everybody very well, but I'm hoping it's happy faces. Oh, I see people. Hi, happy faces. My name is Colleen Daniels. I'm the Deputy Director and Public Health Lead with Harm Reduction International. Thank you all so much for being here today. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting and pay my respects to the Boon Wurrung, Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nations. I recognize that this land, once deemed terra nullius, is strong in over 60,000 years of living culture. I acknowledge that the modern Australia we walk on is tainted with the history of massacres, dispossession of land, the stolen generation, and intergenerational trauma. I pay respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have lost their lives to police brutality and systemic racism. Sovereignty has never been ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So welcome again to the final day. I can't believe it's the final day. I don't know what happened. It went so fast. Final day of the Harm Reduction International Conference. We have been together maybe 4 days, is it 5 days? Could be 13 days. At this point, it's a bit of a blur of data, of inspiration and solidarity. And meeting people in person has been phenomenal. I started with HRI in 2020, so my entire work has been virtual. And to meet you all and put faces and personalities to the emails and the names has just been extraordinary. Though why are you all taller than me? I don't understand how that part happened where every one of you seems to be taller than me. So I'm actually a South African, I'm also Australian, and now I don't know how I ended up in the land of the colonizers, but I live in London. And so it's been an interesting journey to come to this conference and be able to be so inspired by all of you. It's, from the earliest job in my career when I was sort of in the Kingdom of Tonga and working at the UN, my passion has always been challenging systems of oppression. So I'm proud to be part of an incredible collective of people charging forward with big questions about decolonizing drug policy, demanding we are actively anti-racist, and working together to shift power to the global majority. And I thank you all for all of the efforts that you are undertaking, particularly here at this conference, in moving that agenda forward. So it is in this context that I'm honored to chair this morning's panel with 4 incredible thinkers. They're just phenomenal people. I've been speaking with them over the past few weeks about, the title of our session is Creating a Post-Punitive Paradigm and how we actually achieve that. So we'll hear first from Tuari Potiki, and then Dr. Diego Andres Lugo-Vivas, Ms. Ajeng Larasati, and Ms. Nerita Waight. So without further ado, let me introduce Tuari Potiki. Tuari is of Kai Tahu, Kati Mamo, and Waitaha descent. He has more than 30 years experience in Maori alcohol and drug and mental health services as both a clinician and manager. He is currently Director of Maori Development at the University of Otago. He is also Chair of the New Zealand Drug Foundation, Chair of the National Needles Exchange Services Trust, and is a board member of Te Rau Ora, a Maori health workforce development organization. He was also previously a member of the Southern District Health Board. Please help me welcome Tuari.
Tēnā rā tātou meki. Tuatahi ka mihi atu ki a Turuka Rawa no nā ka mea. I haka nōrira hei honore he karori ki te atua he mō kōroko ki te whenua he whakarapai ki ka takataka tātua. Tuarua me mihi atu ki te haukaika no konei. Te mana whenua ānei ka mihi atu ki a koutou mō koutou mana ki tēnei o tātou nei hunga Anei ka mihi atu. So I'm going to translate as I go through because otherwise I'll be waffling on for ages and you won't know what I'm talking about. So I opened up with a very short prayer, which roughly translated means help. I then acknowledged the local people, both here in Melbourne but also of the whole country, and their undisturbed guardianship and custodianship of the land that we're on. He mihi anō atu ki a Uncle Bill mō tōna whakatau ki a mātou me ki i te timatanga o tēnei huinga, just acknowledging Uncle Bill for his welcome and for his kōrero and the way that he welcomed us and allowed us to be here. Hei mihi atu anō ki a koutou ngā karaua me ki, anō konei, I roto I tēnei mahi o tātou, and just acknowledging the elders from here who have been guiding us, not just through this conference, but also over many, many years. He mihi atu hoki ki a koutou ngā kaipakahaere o tēnei huinga, a mea koutou katoa, kua tata mai, and just also acknowledging the organisers and also all of you for coming. Ka ora ki te moka waitaki te awa kaitauhi te iwi, Tuari taku ingoa, no toi paunui tēnei, e mihi atu. So just saying that my name is Tuari, and I'm from the South Island of New Zealand, and from the land of Kaitahu, which is most of the South Island, but we live in the most southern part, based in Dunedin. Just need to acknowledge also, obviously, that I'm not from here. So I'm giving a Aotearoa perspective, a New Zealand perspective on some of these issues. Also acknowledging that while these days I have these titles and labels and things for what I do, really what drives me and what my mahi is based on is my lived experience. And I still recall vividly how that was. How I was treated, and what was done. So I do acknowledge that as being a foundation. I want to touch on a few things today, just briefly, and they are, what do we mean by Indigenous harm reduction? That's what I'm talking about, by the way. The language we use, and also how we are supported to determine our own way forward and our own future. So, Indigenous harm reduction, what is it? Indigenous harm reduction acknowledges the ongoing impacts of colonisation and settlement on Indigenous people, and that colonisation continues to harm us. At its core is the understanding that we, Indigenous people, have never ceded our authority or rangatiratanga, chieftainship, over our lands, our people, and our treasures. We use the word taonga for treasures, and treasures includes not just our places, our waterways, our lakes, our rivers, it also includes our families, our language, and our culture. As has already been said this morning, we have always and will always be here. Much of the earlier discussion around Indigenous harm reduction focused on traditional use, and I think that's going to be touched on again soon, which is hugely important, as it's an obvious and tangible example of how the international conventions and the war on drugs took away traditional use rights and access. So traditional use is an important aspect of Indigenous harm reduction. However, it also includes the broader harms to Indigenous people caused by the war on drugs, drug policy, and racist law enforcement. We just heard, this isn't for publication or tweeting, but we've just heard that the latest results on Now, the police use of discretion for cannabis arrests and convictions. That for 2022, once again, there were more Māori convicted of possession or use than non-Māori, despite us making up only 50% of the population. So when I say racist law enforcement and court system, it's based on some evidence. It's not just what I think. It's resulted in Indigenous populations having significantly higher rates of incarceration, criminalisation, overdose fatalities and other harms, like communicable diseases. Many of you will have heard Helen Clark's opening remarks, and in particular her reference to Māori incarceration rates, where she said, as I've just mentioned, we are 15% of the population, 50% of the prison population are Māori, 60% of the female prison population are Māori, and in our largest women's prison, Arohata, 70% of the inmates are Māori. And as Helen said the other day, 62% of people in prison for drug offences are Māori. These stats aren't changing. They've been the same forever. In fact, they're getting worse. And that's despite us currently having a Minister of Justice and a Minister of Corrections who are both Māori. We've heard about the historical government-sanctioned or initiated and historical and intergenerational abuse of Indigenous families. As you know here, there was the stolen generation. In Canada, they had the residential schools where children were taken and put into schools to assimilate them and make them into good Canadians. And in our own New Zealand example, we have the Royal Commission into Abuse and Care, where since the 1950s, Māori children were taken from their families and put into state care. My cousin worked for that commission when it was first set up and said that in the 1950s, 8 out of 10 children taken were Māori. And when she started working there in 2019, 8 out of every 10 children taken from their families were Māori. In all of these cases, residential schools, stolen generation, and abuse and care, children were targeted. Think about that. Most of us here are parents. They were and are abused, brutalised and criminalised. And it was their being stolen from their families and put into these places that for many started them on the trajectory that included drugs, alcohol, gangs, and they're needing the services that we provide. The Royal Commission in New Zealand are going to report back soon, and they'll probably slap themselves on the wrist and promise to do better. What they won't do is acknowledge the role that the state has played in creating the toxic and harmful environments that so many of our families are living in, which include poverty, homelessness, hopelessness and drug use. As Māori, we understand the connection between the past, present and future, and particularly how so many of the negative issues we are dealing with today have their roots in settlement and colonisation. Our lands, rivers and food sources were taken from us, and with that, the ability for us to live as equals. So Indigenising harm reduction means that it's grounded in local Indigenous knowledge, traditions, teachings, ceremonies and languages. That it's Indigenous-led in design, development and execution. That it's strengths-based. We focus on wellness, strengths and attributes. And that it's culturally grounded. That it provides connection and reconnection to land, people and spirit. Decolonising harm reduction, which is the other side of the same coin, means going beyond just addressing substance use. It means questioning analysing and challenging neocolonial systems and structures to centre power from where it has been systemically removed. It's community-based and peer-led, and it's culturally safe. And it must include the right for us to determine our approaches to harm reduction based on our customs, tikanga, and our traditional practices. It must also include challenging the status quo and the proactive decolonisation and indigenisation of power structures that continue to fuck us over, including power structures within the harm reduction movement. Indigenous harm reduction also involves us questioning and critiquing the definition of harm reduction to make it more meaningful and aligned with our tikanga and our traditional practices. This is challenging for some, as being a harm reductionist is a badge many of us wear proudly. I've looked at the definition, one of the definitions for harm reduction, and it talks about pragmatic policies, programs and practices that emphasise autonomy, compassion and human rights for people who use drugs without coercion, judgment or discrimination. Fantastic. However, there are no Māori words and there is no Māori word as a direct translation for harm reduction, as used in this context. We do, however, have traditional practices and beliefs that have similar intent. I'm not going to go through them all because that would take a whole day, but things like tapu and noa. So we have places that are sacred, or places and times in your life we are tapu, and other times when you are noa. And so it's sort of a protective factor that if something's tapu, it's special. It's hard to explain in English. Anyway, but it's a similar, it's really about protecting people from harm. We have rāhui, which is where if something happens, like just at home a couple of days ago, someone drowned, and we put a rāhui on the sea by where they drowned to stop people taking kaimoana seafood for 24 hours. Because we believe that the wairua or the spirit of that person is still there. So to consume food from that place would be really, really harmful. We also have concepts like karakia, which I did when I started, which is about asking for help and protection from your atua, whatever they are, your guides. So all of these concepts are designed to keep us safe. So to reduce harm from us going to places that we shouldn't be going. They're also values that underpin what we do and how we do things. In our language, we talk about manaki, which is caring for and helping other people. Tika and pono, truth and justice. Aroha, having positive regard for people. That what we do is mana enhancing. So our word mana is sort of a combination of dignity, it's more than that though. Some of it's inherited and some of it you earn. But it's about your, for want of a better term, it's dignity and dignity plus. So we talk about what we do needing to be mana enhancing. So that at no time when we engage with people, with individuals or whānau, do we take mana away from them? Do we make them feel smaller or make them feel less? And kotahitanga, which is all about relationships and connections. Ooh, better speed up. These will be different for each Indigenous population. However, there are many values and beliefs that we share with Indigenous groups worldwide. At home, the term harm reduction has been politicised, including by Māori. I was once told by a senior Māori member of Parliament that Māori do not support harm reduction, we advocate for abstinence. At the Drug Foundation, we've been working with a tikanga and language, a customs and language expert to help redefine harm reduction, the language that we use, using our customs and language. It's been an interesting process because the guy that we used, the tohunga, he knew nothing about us, about our sector, about drugs. And when he drilled down into the meaning of harm reduction, the real meaning, he was easily able to connect what we do with Te Ao Māori or the Māori world. As many of the values that I just mentioned also underpin the work we do in harm reduction. So an important part of our journey together will be to redefine harm reduction to include our Indigenous worldviews, beliefs and language. While this may be challenging for some, it's also an opportunity for us to create a new inclusive harm reduction paradigm for all of us that will be inclusive of Indigenous concepts and beliefs. Finally, this is the third one of these conferences that I've been to. I went to Bangkok and Beirut. And this is the first time from my perspective that we've had such a strong Indigenous content and attendance. It's the first one of these where I felt I've been able to bring all of me without having to leave my Māori at the door. We've been honoured to have received a welcome by Uncle Bill, and I've had a number of Indigenous presentations and side events. It's a great step forward, and I thank you for creating space for us. It really feels like we've been invited into the harm reduction whare, the harm reduction house. If you go to New Zealand, and I'm pretty sure here too, you'll find that all of the land is under the mana or guardianship of different tribes. All of it. Every inch. There's no spare bits. Being invited into the harm reduction space feels a bit like that. Because most of the space is already taken. And has been for a long time. So one of my questions is, how will you make room for us? Where do we fit? How do we fit? As conference attendees? As a special interest group? As a salve for white guilt? Or as equals and partners? I'll give you a clue. So if it's as equals and partners, then where do we sit? So Indigenising harm reduction will require current holders of positions of power to share their power and resources and partner with Indigenous people to meaningfully create change. It'll mean supporting Indigenous leadership and in some cases co-leadership, creating spaces and places to meet. It may mean having to vacate a seat or position you now occupy. And in other cases, bringing in someone to sit alongside you. It'll mean asking rather than telling, sharing decision-making, resources and power. There'll be challenges, as with any relationship and partnership, but there are also huge opportunities. The opportunity for a genuine partnership and for us to walk forward together. We're keen, if you are. Nerita, tēnā tātou, ana iaku nei mihi atu anoki a koutou, ko mutu tēnei kōrero, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, a tēnā koutou katoa. Tēnā koutou, kia ora.
Thank you so much, Tuari. Thank you for asking us to be aware and to take action against white supremacist, neo-colonial harm reduction approaches and drug policy. Thank you for letting us know that we all need to take responsibility for being a good partner in amplifying Indigenous voices. I feel like I've been crying since the opening ceremony. I shouldn't start my day like this. It's not pretty, I'm sorry. Our next speaker is Dr. Diego Andres Lugo-Vivas, who is an academic in Val del Cuaca since 1918. It just feels like that, Diego. When we work in harm reduction, it feels like it's been from 1918. He is an adjunct professor in environmental conflicts. Prior to taking up this position, he was a PhD candidate at the University of Miami. He holds a double graduate major, PhD in International and Comparative Studies, and a graduate diploma in Geographic Information Science and Systems, both from the University of Miami. His research covers the following topics: agrarian studies, land concentration, and resource grabbing in Latin America, everyday forms of dispossession, coca crops and illegal mining, land use cover, change, militarily oriented environmental conservation, portfolios of illicit income, slow environmental violence and toxic dispossession in Colombia, land restitution and reparation policies for victims of armed conflicts, displacement and dispossession against LGBTQI+ groups, corporate greening and spatial data analysis. He's also only 21, so I don't know how he's done all of this, but we're very excited that he's here. Thank you so much, Diego.
Okay, first, I want to thank you, not only Tuari, Colleen, Naomi, Nerita, and Ajeng for this invitation, but also I want to join to the acknowledgement that today that we made on land on the Boon, Wurrung, and Wurundjeri, Wurrung peoples of the Colleen nations. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and pay our respects to the elders across this land. We know that sovereignty has never been ceded. This always has and always will be Aboriginal land. This makes the dispossession and theft of the land of what is now the so-called Australia from Aboriginal peoples an act of extreme cultural violence. And I actually have been wondering all these days that I've been here. This is my first time in Australia, and I've been thinking on acknowledgement and respect. And this is particularly strong for someone like me that comes from the largest indigenous department of Colombia, that evidently has indigenous blood from my maternal side and from my paternal side. And I think, and I wonder in Colombia, and I wonder also in Australia, and you know probably the answer, that acknowledgement and respect is good, is necessary, but it's not enough. As we have done in the case of Colombia, we have realized through extreme forms of violence that acknowledgement and respect needs to go hand in hand with land reparation, land restitution, and an array and countless forms of psycho-emotional, collective, social, and material forms of reparation. And I think this communication, this acknowledgement, and this form of respect connects us to you, particularly to myself. And we realize that indigenous activism and indigenous presence it just goes beyond Australia, New Zealand, and Colombia. Right now, focusing on my address, I'm here to tell you a story, one that will inevitably shape drug reform over the next 10 years as the climate emergency and those on the front lines of the crisis become better understood. I hope my intervention can reveal why reforms will be limited without applying a feminist, queer, radical, and environmental and political ecology perspective. Violence has eaten away at Colombia for almost 7 decades, and it has been fueled by the criminalization and financialization of the rural life, by the accumulation by dispossession and uprooting of hundreds of historical vulnerable groups, by a war on drugs that has become not only part of the Colombian landscape, but also a profitable political, economic, and model of development in Latin America. According to the NGO Global Witness, figures on violence against socio-environmental leaders show that more than 2/3 of the murders of people trying to protect the environment between 2012 and 2021 took place in Latin America, with 342 killed in Brazil and 322 in Colombia. 270 in the Philippines, 154 in Mexico, and 117 in Honduras. This places Colombia and Brazil as the 2 most violent countries in the world for environmentalists. But comparatively speaking, meaning in terms of the global population, Colombia has become the most violent country in terms of the safety for environmental and land defenders. Recent expressions in Colombia show a highly racialized, gendered, and highly selective form of extermination, focused on leaders who carry on their shoulders the struggle against extractivism, against the armed actors who control drug trafficking and the exploitation of commodities such as gold and timber, as well as against all those who seek to perpetuate renewed forms of accumulation, environmental damage, and more dispossession. To talk about post-punitive paradigms, as I was asked for this intervention, several ideas come to my mind. Although in this address, I'll focus on 2 forms of environmental and territorial suffering, from which I'll propose some post-punitive strategies. First, expressions of environmental everyday violence, which derive from the war on drugs, an aspect that goes far beyond the so famous aerial spraying of glyphosate in regions where coca has been grown. And second, territorial violence, very similar, and understanding territory as the bodies of cisgender, but particularly transgender women who respond to a cycle of violence very similar to that faced by coca-growing families. If I speak of environmental violence, I find in several countries, usually in the South, first, a stubborn focus of the governments in power and pressure from foreign governments, we know in America which one, to attack the lowest link in the transnational drug chain, to attack the poor and dispossessed peasant of Afro-descendant, mestizo, and indigenous origin. That's the focus. In countries like Colombia, where coca crops grow as a response to the little or no possibilities of improvement of the quality of life of people with no foreseeable future, attempts to formalize activities associated with both marijuana and coca have had paradoxical consequences. Regarding coca substitution processes, as I've shown in previous articles, recent failed policies, such as the Comprehensive National Program for the Substitution of Illicit Crops, are due, among others, to its stubborn corporate approach and the lack of guarantee from the governments in power to carry them out. I have argued before that peasants, years after the beginning of the coca substitution programs in Colombia, haven't had productive projects or technical assistance materialize, nor have the state undertaken new investments in rural infrastructure. Instead, what we have been pushed is to accept plans of small-scale corporate agriculture that, in addition to being at odds with the autonomy of the peasant production model, have been poorly implemented. While peasants who replace their coca crops have faced growing impoverishment, the perceived ecological impacts have been equally negative. There has been evidence of progressive erosion in areas where eradication of coca have been carried out and where there have not been no replanting of new crops. So poorly implemented substitution strategies of coca have resulted in peasant families' experiences both slow violence and existential threats to their survival, while the so-called territorial peace has become an increasingly unattainable goal. During these coca substitution processes and in our history of interdiction and forced eradication in Colombia, slow environmental violence has been perpetuated in different ways. Structural violence due to the neglect and disempowerment of historically marginalized groups such as LGBTQAI+ ethnic communities, women, the elder, and the youth. Environmental violence due to the glyphosate and other chemical spraying of coca crops. Glyphosate spraying, an increasingly toxic combination of pesticides and herbicides for illicit crops. The promotion of corporate greening to replace illicit crops. Health impacts, especially on women, due to daily contact with toxic substances. Violence due to the failure of voluntary substitution policies that have produced hunger, food insecurity, erosion, incessant soil washing, collective anguish, anxiety, and depression. And finally, the emergence of highly toxic activities outside a formal regulatory framework, such as illegal mining, green mining, logging, and other extractive activities with resounding consequences for bodies and territories alike. In this war on drugs, the war on drugs produces direct and indirect environmental effects, albeit differentiated, on the population that lives from the commercial exploitation of coca. First, coca crops require extensive use of pesticides. Second, several toxic chemicals are employed in the process of transformation of coca leaves and later discharged into soil and water sources. Around 284 liters of gasoline are necessary to process just 1 kilo of cocaine. And that without counting toluene, sulfuric acid, acetone, concrete, and many more materials. And third, interdiction, state and foreign interdiction. State and foreign pressures to control the cultivation of coca and its transformation into cocaine, hydrochloride, have triggered the use of glyphosate, paraquat, and other herbicides in aerial and forced manual eradication. In particular, in the departments where I live and where I conducted field research, aerial fumigations have led to the long-term poisoning of their territories, and in particular, to processes of soil degradation, deforestation, and water contamination. Thus, the combination of interdiction and the high pollutant loads around coca, and particularly around its processing, not only accelerate the creation of toxic bodies and territories, but also produce reproductive, cutaneous, and respiratory sequelae. There exist several instances in which reproductive rights have been altered. But this doesn't stop here. One of the great moral and economic platforms of interdiction and this absurd war on drugs is the legalization of social and productive life in the face of the dark scenarios marked by war, coca, cocaine, and illegality, as we have been told. Therefore, the solutions proposed in recent years in Colombia, but also in Peru, Central America, and part of Southeast Asia, particularly in Myanmar, which I am most aware and I know personally, is the promotion at all costs of life towards legality, not necessarily towards decriminalization of grower families, and the pursuit of a certain degree of formal and institutional development. Is this desirable? Maybe. It depends. And the history has shows that implementation of such programs of legalization and formalization leaves many gaps and much more violence to be resolved. My guiding notion here is that if legality comes out without addressing the abuse of power towards the poor and dispossessed people of color and LGBTQAI+, those historically subjected to gender and racialized everyday unarmed violence, then legalization and regulation, it's going to be simply a transfer of power between privileged elites and more legal abusers. As the increasingly concentrated and monopolized marijuana industry is showing now in the US and in Colombia. Of these dire consequences, I will focus on two. First is the promotion of technological packages in agriculture that benefit a small-scale monoculture. It's revealing that productive diversification, meaning what defines an indigenous or Afro-descendant peasantry in Latin America and the Caribbean, and which in great has been occurred due to the income left by coca, is not even considered. They are therefore asked to change to a legal monoculture, of which in many cases they have no tradition, which also increases substantially their toxic load. Focusing on this last aspect, the toxicity derived from the transition to new crops represents a potential toxic load higher than that registered for coca crops. When making a characterization of agrochemical use both in productive units with illicit crops, such as coca, and those that are making the transition or that already made the transition, I have found that technological packages are indeed more toxic in the case of the latter, those who made the transition to legality, in the use of both herbicides and fertilizers. And within family units, women tend to be more associated with closer exposure to this new toxic load. But there is another aspect that is little talked about, and it's the prevalence of corporate greening as a way out of dependence on coca crops. The promotion of monocultures under the idea of legality, formality, and sustainability is done under the premise that these families are inserted into profitable economies, providers of clean energy, and replicators of the successful business model. But when this corporate greening is taken from the small farm to a regional productive platform, the impacts I have just mentioned here are triggered on a large scale. As it has happened in the past, the transition from illicitness to licitness, particularly in agriculture, has resulted in more land concentration, more grabbing of environmental resources, and more highly toxic practices associated with large-scale extraction. In Colombia, Central America, and Southeast Asia, just to name a few, efforts to substitute one economy for another have led to the exacerbation of land grabbing. As has happened in post-conflict Myanmar, after the negotiation of ceasefire agreements in the north of the country, Myanmar has experienced an accelerated process of land grabbing linked to the legalization of territories previously dependent on opium and heroin economies. The mechanism used land concessions, mainly to trans-Asian conglomerates. In Colombia, the figure has not been concessions, but accelerated land titling, concentrated in national and trans-Latina conglomerates. And in Colombia, the figure, which has exacerbated land grabs. This not only has increased the inequitable distribution of land and resources in one of the most unequal countries in the world, Colombia, but also has made the panorama of toxicity even more complex, with palm oil, meat, and flex crops conglomerates involved in very questionable environmental practices, and all of them facing legal claims for pollution. The formula for attacking illegality has been a mixture of land reconcentration, resource grabbing, and the spread of a higher level of toxicity that affects families living around such clusters, all within the framework of beautiful discourses of legality and attempts to formalize former insurgent and coca-dependent regions. If I'm going to talk about post-punitive paradigms and decriminalization, all this should be discussed, because decriminalization must be done in a proper way. And for this, remembering the consequences of a war fueled by the incentives of drug trafficking, and particularly by its prohibition, is necessary. This is a war that has produced armed violence, but that has been mixed with countless forms of violence. It is true that Colombia has lived through decades of conflict, but this is not the main violence that concerns me. And I say this as an indigenous, openly gay scholar living in the south of Colombia. Our violence has been combined with patriarchal, machista, cisgender, colonial, racist, and ecological violence as a result of our history of colonialism and extractivism in Latin America. Therefore, to speak of post-punitive paradigms means to speak of those roots of violence that are beyond the armed conflict. Expressions grounded everywhere, in America, Europe, Asia, and Oceania, and Africa. Grounded not only in patriarchy, racism, and colonialism, but in the financialization, privatization, and extraction of all forms of life. These are the foundations that should be discussed in post-punitive paradigms and in strategies that seek to decriminalize the lowest link in the cocaine, heroin supply chains. The HRI Congresses have been a space to debate decriminalization and regulation usually associated with drug use. I can say that from a production point of view, we face the same challenges. And I know this pretty well, because my life has been shaped by both. If I counter the situation of trans sex workers in Colombia, close to me, for personal and professional reasons, and if I analyze their situation in terms of their vulnerability using different cocktail of substances, from solutions to even a stronger dissociative drugs, the trends are similar. Most of them, and most of us, have been displaced and end up facing uprooting from the regions of expulsion and reception. They have been the product of a criminalizing, racialized, and patriarchal system that expelled them because they don't fit in. And as peasant of indigenous and Afro-descendant origin, the lowest link in the transnational cocaine chain, trans people collide with a world of prejudices and criminalizing visions that leave them without options and trapped in a world of rejection, decriminalization, and vulnerabilities. Post-punitive strategies need to be reoriented to groups from peasants to indigenous to Afro-descendants to LGBTQ leaders and communities that face such structures of violence on a daily basis. It is on them, it is on us that attention must fall, and it is us who must define and reaffirm our course. It is us who should be responsible for the development of strategies that seek our well-being. If post-punitive strategies do not address these structures and systems of violence, solutions will be no more than palliative measures. This includes thinking about mechanisms of reparation, reconciliation, and non-repetition, so much in vogue in the world of transitional justice, but little discussed in these spaces. Because making reparations to all of those who have suffered the scourges of this war, from indigenous and Afro-Latinx families to uprooted trans sex workers in Colombia, implies recognizing historical debts to them, allowing their voices to gain important spaces, and achieving something that still seems difficult to grasp, that their most basic rights and dignified living conditions must be recognized and guaranteed. Something so basic and easy to say, but so difficult to achieve. But when I encourage you to integrate in all of your thinking innovative reforms and actively pursue their inclusion in your designs of regulation, that is something that we actually can do in this room. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diego, it's devastating when you hear about the impact, isn't it, just on toxic violence and dispossession and what's actually going on with our lands. And I think it makes us realize that when we look at harm reduction and drug policy, we also have to think of what our responses will be in terms of legality. How are we going to address this? Because quite frankly, a capitalist corporate response is not going to work unless we center Indigenous voices. Our next speaker, we actually call her a bit of a rock star at Harm Reduction International, is Ajeng Larasati, who is our human rights lead. She is a human rights and public health expert with 12 years of experience in program management, organizational development, and strategic advocacy. Ajeng holds an LLM degree in economic, social, and cultural rights from the University of Essex and a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Indonesia. Her work focuses on carrying out legal empowerment, capacity building, advocacy and research on the issue of HIV and human rights, drug policy, LGBTQ rights, and mental health. Ajeng also coordinates the Lawyering on the Margins Network and sits on the steering committee of the HIV Justice Network. She is on the board of directors for LBHM and advisory board for OPSI, an Indonesian network of sex workers. Please welcome our rock star, Ajeng.
I hope it's a K-pop rock star, not just like rock star. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ajeng Larasati, and I'm the Human Rights Lead at Harm Reduction International. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay respect to the Bunurong, Bunwurrung, and Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nations. We pay respects to the elders of the community and extend our recognition to their descendants. Let's start. My drug policy journey began 15 years ago when I, as a law student, joined a legal aid organization in Indonesia called LBH Masyarakat, or LBHM. LBHM represented death row inmates, advocated for drug law reform in Indonesia, and provided free legal information and trainings, among many other things. And just last week, one of LBHM's longest clients on death row was granted a commutation to life imprisonment after more than 20 years of being on death row. So congratulations for LBHM, if any of them are here. Does this work? Okay. I want to share some of my experience in working on the drug policy and human rights issues before looking at the disturbing trends in the death penalty for drugs globally and what it means for all of us here to take a stand against this human rights violation. And to start, I want to introduce you to Humphrey Jefferson, or Jeff, as we knew him. I'm sorry, the photo resolution is not good. It is what it is. He was my first client on death row. 20 years ago, Jeff, a Nigerian national, was arrested in Indonesia after police found heroin at a restaurant that he owned. The evidence against Jeff was non-existent, and indeed, multiple witnesses confirmed his innocence. But a year after his arrest, after a flawed trial and no proper access to legal assistance, Jeff was sentenced to death. The court justified its ruling by saying that, and I quote this from the judgment itself, "Black people from Nigeria are often under police surveillance for drug trafficking in Indonesia." In addition to this overt racism, Jeff was kept in inhumane prison conditions, like many other people in prison in Indonesia, and was tortured by police to try and extract confession from him. But Jeff was resolute in his innocence. He would never confess or ask for forgiveness for something that he did not do. In 2016, Jeff was among 4 people executed for drugs by firing squad. To add to this injustice, 1 year after his death, Indonesia's ombudsman determined that the execution was unlawful because Jeff had a pending clemency decision, and nothing should have happened until that was resolved. I wish I could say that Jeff's case was an anomaly, but in fact, it's a snapshot of a growing problem that extends well beyond Indonesia. One of draconian laws that kill and persecute people who are racially, socially, and economically marginalized, all in the name of being tough on drugs. At Harm Reduction International, we have monitored the use of the death penalty for drugs globally since 2007, and just recently published our 12th report on this issue. Of 35 countries that retain the death penalty for drugs, a handful have carried out executions in recent years, a practice that clearly violates international human rights law. Many of these countries are opaque about sentencings and executions, so please consider the following figures to be the minimum number. Despite promising downward trends in the number of executions carried out since 2015, we saw a more than 100% increase in 2022 when at least 285 people were executed for drugs globally. Much of the recorded increase was driven by Iran. But this figure excludes China, Vietnam, and North Korea, where state secrecy makes getting data impossible. And in line with this trend, more people were sentenced to death for drugs in 2022 compared to preceding years. Overall, in the last decade, at least 4,000 people were executed for drug offenses, and close to 4,000 people now sit on death row for drugs globally. And execution for drug offenses account for 1 in 3 of all executions carried out globally. These figures are shocking in their own right, but it only tells part of the story. Behind the numbers are people who are some of the society's most vulnerable, who often act at the lowest level of drug trade, which they may have entered out of economic desperation or coercion, and who ultimately make easier targets for legal persecutions. In Iran, for example, around 40% of people executed for drugs in 2022 were of Baluchi ethnicity, a group that accounts for just 2% of Iran's population. As our colleagues in Iran state, this fact underscores the entrenched discrimination and repression that Baluchi ethnicity faced for more than decades. And once arrested for drugs in countries that carries the death penalty, they are often subjected to endless injustices, such as intimidation from court, torture, or no adequate legal assistance. From our work on this issue, there are 3 things that I want to stress. First, the world will never achieve death penalty abolition without significant drug law reform. I repeat, the world will never achieve death penalty abolition without significant drug law reform. More countries abolished the death penalty in 2022, while 125 countries supported a UN General Assembly resolution calling for a moratorium on the use of the death penalty. But the increased application of the death penalty for drug offenses, as I just outlined before, goes firmly against the global trend towards abolition. Second, the response from UN bodies and other countries to the use of the death penalty for drug offenses is simply inadequate. There has been some public condemnation of offending countries from their peers or other international institutions, but much of it appears largely symbolic and without sanction. And regrettably, The UN Office on Drugs and Crime, again, failed to publicly condemn this practice last year. As the only UN agencies with a mandate on drugs, what UNODC say publicly matters. Its silence could be interpreted as approval of this barbaric practice. Third, the death penalty is the tip of the iceberg when it comes to rights abuses in the name of drug control. Several countries around the world have in recent years implemented increasingly harsh policies against people who use drugs or who are involved in the drug trade, and many have dug in against the human rights agenda. The slaughter of people in the Philippines is the most egregious example, but the privation of liberty, torture, cruel and inhuman treatment are commonplace across the world. And even countries that have abolished the death penalty in practice still apply extreme punishment through lengthy prison sentences for drug offenses or compulsory treatment center. Millions of people were detained in these facilities in Southeast Asia over the last decade, and human rights violations are well documented with no evidence of positive public health outcomes. And this is despite the UN agencies jointly calling for the closure of such facilities in 2012. Yeah. Some of the examples that I have given are on the extreme end, and it may not directly impact the day-to-day work of many of us here. But injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Countries that kill, torture, and persecute people in the name of drug control do so because they are propped up by an international system that allows and promotes it. All of us here have the power to advocate for change. In addition to the work that we do at home, we must make sure that our countries never stay silent when there is an execution or other violations of people's dignity. Let's hold countries accountable when they give international funding to prolific human rights abusers and make sure that this money does not enable. And let's continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with our colleagues who are on the front lines facing down these atrocities, because there is a strength in our solidarity. I want to close by sharing a message that Jeff gave us a few minutes before he was executed. I'll try my best not to cry. This is the most emotional part probably of my speech. He said, "I know you tried hard to stop my execution. You tried your best with everything, all the power you have in you. This is on the government, not you. So to everyone fighting hard, keep fighting hard, but be easy on yourself on this long and winding battle. Thank you."
Thank you so much, Ajeng, for highlighting how obscene it is that in 2023 we still think it is okay to kill people for a drug offense. And for pointing out that actually silence is violence, and silence is complicity by our governments and by United Nations bodies who sit back and allow this to continue to happen. By United Nations bodies who actually empower countries to continue this unbelievably cruel intervention. Our next speaker is Nerita Waight. Nerita is a Yorta Yorta and Narangiri woman with Tanarang connections and is the Chief Executive Officer of the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service. Nerita has helped expand the work of VALS, the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service, to meet the needs of Aboriginal communities, notably establishing Balit Nulu, a holistic and culturally safe legal service for Aboriginal children. As CEO, Nerita has also overseen the expansion of VAL's policy and advocacy work, and the establishment of the Wirraway Police and Prison Accountability Practice, which has supported clients on several high-profile Aboriginal deaths in custody cases. Wirraway supported Uncle Percy Lovett, the partner of Veronica Nelson, during the coronial inquest into her death in custody. Nerita is also the proud mother of 2 young boys, ensuring that they grow up with strong connections to their culture and kin, and in a world that is safer for Aboriginal people. This is a key motivation for Nerita's work. Please welcome Nerita.
Thank you. First, I'd like to begin today by acknowledging traditional owners of the land that we're on. So that's the Wurundjeri people, the Bunurong people, and the Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nations. And I pay my respects to the elders past and present. Being on this land, it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge elders like Uncle William Barak, a leader, advocate and diplomat who worked to win human and legal rights for Aboriginal people and has a name similar to a former US president. And Uncle Jagga Jagga, a freedom fighter who never gave up trying to win back stolen land. Sovereignty was never ceded. On this land or anywhere else in Australia, it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And if you have time during this conference, which I'm not sure if it was 13 days or 4 days, that hasn't yet been established, I encourage you to head over to Fed Square where you can visit the Koori Heritage Trust and grab something to eat at Mabu Mabu, which is a Torres Strait Islander-owned restaurant. As stated, I'm Nerita Waight. I'm a Yorta Yorta Ngarrindjeri woman with Tanarong connections. I'm also lucky enough to be the CEO of VALS, and I've been there almost a decade, so I'm pretty sure I've served some form of imprisonment. I started as a solicitor in civil and human rights practice before moving on to what was then called family and children. Before that, I was a government solicitor. Don't hold it against me. And after doing various roles in our different legal practices at VALS, I found that I wanted to do more policy and advocacy work. So what I did was transition to a dual role. That meant I could keep my legal work up while also transitioning out into systemic reform, which has been the most rewarding part of my career, to be honest. And I do this because I wanted to create change for my community, but most of all for my children. I didn't want them to be standing here 30 years later delivering the same speeches and the same information that I give today. Despite what seems as an impressively large organisation, we're incredibly small. We have slightly over 100 staff, although that includes a number of casual and part-time staff, particularly in our custody notification service. We have 5 legal practices: criminal law, civil and human rights, Aboriginal families practice, the Lit and the Loo, and of course our Wirraway Police and Accountability Practice. On top of that, our advocacy work has continued to expand in recent years. We've produced a mountain of policy work, both detailed submissions and papers for government and stakeholders, even when they don't ask, as well as webinars, fact sheets and social media content for our clients and communities. And at the heart of our organisation, those are community justice programs. Those are our Aboriginal staff members who work on the ground with our clients and communities each and every day. They also deliver incredibly beneficial programs like Bagaruk, which is our transitional housing service for Aboriginal women leaving prison, our custody notification service, where if an Aboriginal person is arrested in Victoria, we are notified. I want to note that they've received over 11,000 notifications the last financial year, and from that made 70,000 welfare checks in response to those notifications to ensure that Aboriginal people were safe and understood their rights, and most importantly, had access to legal advice and representation. The community we serve are over-policed and over-criminalised, and despite the crime rates decreasing, Aboriginal communities continue to be the most incarcerated peoples on earth. In one 6-month period alone, we saw arrests of our communities increase by 18%. In the prior year, it was 22% for the whole calendar year, which means by the end of this financial year, we're headed towards an increase of anywhere between 38 to 42%. Despite our clients being unique individuals with their own hopes and dreams, there are certain threads that weave them together. Being Aboriginal, being or having been in out-of-home care, having had early contact with police, mental health, disability, homelessness, alcohol or other drug use, poverty, lack of education and/or employment. These threads often see them cycling in and out of the so-called justice system, often due to minor offending, with little ability to see their hopes and aspirations realised in 8 square metres. One of the persistent threads in our service is the over-policing of drugs. Whilst the available statistics indicate that drug use is broadly stable among Aboriginal people and declining for some types of drugs, whilst it is increasing for non-Aboriginal people, we still see charges for drug use against Aboriginal people are increasing rapidly and significantly faster than charges against non-Aboriginal people. For example, in Victoria, the charging of Aboriginal people with drug use and possession offences increased by 128% from 2013 to 2022. For non-Aboriginal people, in that same period, it was an increase of 17%. Last year, VALS published a policy paper titled Harm Reduction, Not Harm Maximisation, an alternative approach to drug possession based upon the experiences of our clients and communities. Our recommendations in this paper were that possession of drugs for personal use or any drug should be decriminalised. The model for decriminalisation should meaningfully reduce contact with police and drive an increase in people accessing healthcare supports if they need and want it. And that Aboriginal communities should be consulted so that the reforms actually work for them. Who knew if you design things from community, they actually work? In Victoria, there are 2 police diversion programs in use, something called the Cannabis Cautioning Program and the Drug Diversion Program for all non-cannabis drugs. People facing drug charges who participate in the Victorian Drug Diversion Program are 10% less likely to offend. However, diversion continues to be underutilised and cautions and diversions are given to Aboriginal people at significantly lower rates. These diversion programs are also based in institutions of power and control which create fear for Aboriginal people, rather than being based in community where people are safe, people are cared for, but most of all, they are understood. The evidence is clear that policing drug use does tremendous damage, particularly to Aboriginal communities, and alternative responses to drug use are more likely to result in better outcomes. But there remains a general reluctance to engage in a transformation of drug policy. Government and other key decision makers, and instead a continued over-reliance on policing, to the tune of $2 billion additional investment in one financial budget. This reluctance could be informed by the pervasive stigma around drug use that is still strong in some sections of society. VALS recently represented the partner of Veronica Nelson, Uncle Percy Lovett, in the coronial inquest into the passing of her death at Dame Phyllis Frost, which is one of two women's prisons in Victoria. Veronica was a strong Gudijamara Dada Jurong Wiradjuri and Yorta Yorta woman. She was connected to her culture and close to her family and her community. I tell you this because I don't want you to remember her solely for being another Aboriginal woman who died in custody. I want you to remember her as a strong woman grounded in culture who had hopes and aspirations for her family, for herself, which she was robbed of. She was 37 years old when she died at Dame Phyllis Frost Centre. That's 2 years older than me. Only 3 days after being arrested and refused bail for shoplifting-related offences. Police, in discussing why she had engaged in shoplifting, and even the magistrate herself talked about how she was a drug user and how that was probably the reason why she most likely committed those offences. Her trial hadn't started, this was just a bail hearing. Yet they'd already predetermined that most likely she was guilty, and the reason she was guilty was because she was a drug user. During her final night in prison, she was distressed and cried out for medical assistance a number of times. She was told during these calls that she was disturbing others, that there was no help that could be given to her, that if she didn't stop calling out for help, the other prisoners would become upset with her and she would face retribution. That wasn't the case. At the same time Veronica was making these calls for assistance, women who were in that same cell block were calling the corrections officers, asking them to help because it sounded like somebody was dying. Despite this, nobody came to help Veronica. Nobody came to get her the medical assistance she required. The corrections officer couldn't even be bothered to walk the few steps down the hallway to check her cell to make sure that she was okay. Sadly, she passed. Most horrifically, in her final moment, she was calling out for her long-lost father for help because that was the only person she believed could do it. The coroner found there were pervasive stigma at DPFC towards women who use injectable drugs, and that Veronica's care and treatment by staff while at DPFC was influenced by drug use stigma, and that this casually contributed to her passing. Veronica was in prison after being denied bail for minor shoplifting charges. She died in prison because staff, including medical staff, did not give her the treatment she needed, in part because of drug use stigma, in others due to racism. It is deeply troubling that prison staff have such pervasive stigma against people who use drugs when our criminal legal system is designed to funnel those very people into it. But the truth is that there are many sections of society where this stigma is strong, particularly in institutions of power. Another reason for reluctance to engage in transformation of drug policy is a colonial mindset. Australia is a nation built on invasion and colonisation, and Victoria is a state that is particularly obsessed with crime and punishment, but particularly punishment. When the British colonised this land, they declared it terra nullius, unoccupied by other humans. Terra nullius stands as the original sin of the colonial legal system. It denied our humanity and justified the theft of our land, and continues to do so. From invasion in 1788 right up to early mid-20th century, there are many examples of attempted genocides. Massacres were a regular occurrence during the frontier wars as colonisers wrestled control of the land. In the 20th century, Australia moved to try and eradicate Aboriginal people by destroying our culture, by destroying our kinship, by destroying our families. Aboriginal children were forcibly taken from their families and forced to grow up in white households, effectively as slaves. You might think this was a long time ago. It wasn't. This policy applied to my grandmother, my grandfather, my great-grandmother. And it only stopped when my mother was 8. The criminal legal system was designed by colonists to enable these atrocities. And the criminal legal system continues to destroy our lives and culture by making us the most over-incarcerated peoples on earth. In Victoria, recent elections had a heavy focus on tough-on-crime politics. Many punitive laws have been introduced, including bail laws that have caused prison populations to explode. There's been a huge increase in the amount of money spent on prisons and police. This is under a state government that calls itself the most progressive government in the nation, who've committed to voice, treaty and truth. But this is not a new phenomenon in Victoria. Victoria was the last jurisdiction in Australia to execute a prisoner. The Premier at the time, Henry Bolte, you may have passed his bridge on the way here, actively campaigned on ensuring that the person was executed. And the first people to be executed in Victoria were 2 Aboriginal men. Whilst we don't execute people anymore, we kill them in other ways, slowly and painfully. Our major news outlets, particularly the Herald Sun, basically only report on 3 things: the AFL, the weather, and crime. Both of the major parties have tried to pass legislation in the last decade that were designed to keep specific individuals in prison for life. And the Police Association regularly ramps up colonial obsession with crime and punishment. They regularly run scare campaigns about crime waves, even though the crime rate has been persistently low for decades now. One example that we hope will create a path forward for drug decriminalisation in Victoria is the decriminalisation of public intoxication. 32 years ago, the Royal Commission to Help Deaths in Custody recommended the decriminalisation of public intoxication. Every death in custody that the Royal Commission investigated in Victoria has included arrests for public intoxication, but it took 30 years for the Victorian Parliament to pass legislation decriminalising public intoxication in 2021. Once again, this cost the life of another Aboriginal woman, Auntie Tanya Day, who was a proud Yorta woman who was arrested for public intoxication and then died in a police cell after bumping her head. Her only crime was falling asleep on a train. A white woman for public intoxication arrested on the same day was not arrested and instead was driven home by police to be in a place of safety. Auntie Tanya's Day's family led a grassroots campaign to decriminalise public intoxication, and thanks to their efforts, the Parliament passed to do that. Legislation will come into effect later this year. You might have heard the Wayne Gatt, the head of the police union, talking about how this is coming into effect on Melbourne Cup Day. Apparently it's a big deal for some people, not for me. And he's telling you, or telling society, that this is a huge problem because there's going to be all these drunk people who need to be put in cells. That's not the right way to do it. Evidence suggests that. The public health model that will be developed ensures that people are transported to a place of safety. People are given help if they want it. There's no mandatory treatment. There's no compulsory path to go down. It is user choice. I think the key lesson from the decriminalisation of public intoxication is that reforms need to be led by people and communities who are most impacted. In this term of Parliament, there is an opportunity to criminalise drugs if government wants to. The government controls the lower house of the Parliament and can pass legislation in the upper house with support of at least 6 out of 11 crossbench MPs. We believe at least 8 out of those 11 would support the decriminalisation of drugs in some form from our engagement with them. The Victorian government is not powerless. They can make these changes. They just need the desire to do so. Reform is life and death for Aboriginal communities. We'll continue to be over-policed, over-incarcerated and die in custody if we do not engage in the transformative change our society requires. Drug decriminalisation is one aspect of that transformative change, and it must reverse the structures and maintain Victoria's colonial mindset and obsession with punishment. We cannot continue to punish individuals for our failures to provide a safe and supported social net that is predicated on contemporary social values. Harper Lee, allegedly the author of one of my favourite books, wrote, "You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it." If policy and lawmakers want to create good public policy, they need to do it from the perspective of those concerned. They need to understand the point of view of our community members who use drugs so that they understand what will actually make positive change. They need to step outside of the shoes of police and punishment and into our shoes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nerita. When you said Aboriginal people are the most incarcerated in the world, I think it's such a shameful indictment of the systemic racism that is entrenched in drug policy, but also in the Australian government's decision to go for punitive responses. And I think we should all, as Australians, this is something we can actually advocate against. This is something that we can actually start to think about even this year, where in 2023, there will be a referendum, a national referendum here in Australia to give a voice to Aboriginal people in the Constitution. And the fact that it's 2023 and we still need a referendum to do that also tells us where we are in Australian society. It is so difficult to be able to put into a bit of a summary what we've heard today, because we've heard some of the unbelievable issues that we face in drug policy and harm reduction, but we've also heard about some of the ways forward. So I'm going to try and do my best, but remember, we were also, it has been an emotional morning. But I think moving forward, one of the things that we have to ensure happens, and particularly if you are a co-liberator and a co-conspirator in this audience, not just an ally, that we center Indigenous, Black, and brown voices, and not just to have a quota, not just to have a seat at the table, but to be funded decision makers who can decide who have self-determination. We need to decriminalize, and we need to end the death penalty. We need to abolish the prison system, and most importantly, we need to divest from punitive approaches to drug policy and invest in harm reduction, in land restoration, in reparations, and in ensuring that every person who has been harmed by current drug policy, that we hear their voices, that we make it up to them, and that we change lives in the future. I'm not very good on the tweeter. I really am not. I know our communications strategist is always saying, please get on there and tweet. But this morning I happened to be on there and I saw a tweet by Dr. Alex Stevens, who actually happens to also be a board member of Harm Reduction International. And he said that this conference has felt a bit like a temporary utopian space. But I thought the rest of his tweet actually tells us where we need to go in terms of creating a post-punitive paradigm. And he said, it's been a space where people can imagine and plan for a future where people who use drugs are treated with compassion and respect, where human rights are made real, and where oppression ends. And I think those are the key messages that we can take from this morning. Thank you all, and please help me in thanking one more time our 4 phenomenal speakers, Tuari, Diego, Ajeng, and Nerita. Enjoy the rest of the day.